Hello, fellow Rebel Capitals. Hope you're well. I am back with my good buddy Robert Barnes, and we've got a lot to talk about. I saw in the news yesterday or the day prior how we're sending all of these gang members to El Salvador, to this very scary-looking prison. So in my mind, I'm asking myself, okay, is this constitutional? What are the ramifications? Does this put us on a slippery slope? There's a lot of questions that need to be answered here. And who better to answer those questions than my good buddy Robert Barnes. So thanks for coming on such short notice.
I thought your first question was going to be, how did a bunch of independent libertarians get together and name their group the Collective?
Well, there you go. He's got our t-shirt on for the mastermind group I've got with Kenny McElroy and the real estate guys and Jason Hartman. But anyway, my friend, getting to the topic du jour. First of all, what on earth is going on? Let's just summarize for people that might have not seen this in the news, and then we'll get into kind of, is this right? Is this wrong? What does the Constitution say? What's the act going back to 1798, the Alien
Enemies Act?
Enemies Act. There you go. We're going to dive into this as well. So give us the 30,000-foot view of what's going on.
Yeah, so the Trump administration perceives that what the Biden administration did was let a lot of people in illegally, and they're trying to clean up that aspect because of the impact it's had on the politics of of various communities, the economy of various communities, the culture and local tax and economic impact in general, things like infrastructure, schools, housing, all the different ways in which illegal immigration can impact a local community. And so his goal has been to do mass deportations. And there was always questions about how well that could practically be achieved, and then how well that could be achieved within the laws. And they've targeted two groups out of the gate. One are members of the TDA gang out of Venezuela, which they believe the Venezuelan authorities deliberately sent into the United States, both as a way to relieve their own internal crime problem in Venezuela on the eve of their past elections, but also as a payback and punishment, if you will, of the U.S. for their sanctions on Venezuela that the Maduro regime blamed for their economic woes. Others would attribute it to their questionable economic and currency control decisions, but that was the internal political excuse. So there's a high priority on TDA gang members. They want out. Then it's going to be other drug and other cartel members, and gang members are the top priority. The other parallel priority that has triggered a lot of free speech controversial questions has been all the disruption that took place post October 7th on American college campuses, organized by a range of pro-Palestinian or anti-Israeli protesters, depending on how you perceive it, led to a lot of angst within a part of the Jewish community in the U.S. And the Trump has said that he doesn't want anybody that hates America in America. And he doesn't want anybody that's undermining America to be in America if they're not an American. It's classic, Trump is Trump. So the targeting is of, I don't know how people ended up on this list. And then there's, I think, some fair questions about whether the proper prioritization has been made. Because you have, clear-cut radical activists who are disruptive, the kind of people that are, hey, let's go firebomb a Tesla today kind of folks. And then you have others that are just like grad students with controversial opinions.
PhD gal that writes an op-ed. And then the next day she gets effectively mugged by guys in masks, not even knowing what the hell is going on when she's walking down the street with her Starbucks.
Correct. And I get they want to do shock and awe. I think the shock and awe is best used on the gang members and people like that are really causing domestic disturbances more so than op-ed co-authors. And particularly, it's not only an op-ed, it's an op-ed at Tufts. My niece went to Tufts. I was like, she's almost full commie these days politically, but it's like, seriously, it's Tufts. I mean, who really cares? I share some of that skepticism that others have in that area. Now, some of my liberal friends have jumped on bandwagons that I don't think they fully realize don't really exist from a legal perspective. Because the president is given the best way I've always analogized it to people is think about inviting somebody into your home. And if you invite somebody into your home, you can kick them out at any time. It's not considered punishment to kick them out. Now, if you keep them there and you kidnap them and you try to do something, that's illegal. But you can always kick them out of your home. Immigration law pretty much around the world operates on the same fundamental premise that if you're here by permission within a country, they can deport you. Now, there's things they can't do. They can't punish you domestically without following their internal constitutional rules and a range of treaties and universal human rights provisions. But American law, like most law around the world, does not see deportation as deprivation of property or liberty. They don't see it as punishment. So a lot of talk about, what due processes do. Generally, constitutionally, pretty much none is required for a deportation. And the reason for that is deportation is not seen as punishment. It's, hey, you're at somebody's house. They don't want you at the house anymore. You're out. And immigration law is mostly the same way, unless you have an expectation of liberty or property interest. And that's what, like, a green card can create that. A student visa creates some of that. But like people who are never lawfully here, like there was this big story that blew up this week on the news media would tell you a sweethearted Maryland father of 3 with one son that's autistic, who's been here for almost better part of more than a decade, was suddenly taken and removed and sent to evil El Salvador, which is a hellhole, according to these new liberal media requirements. I thought that was politically incorrect to say, but apparently now it's okay. The actual story is that he was an MS-13 member who came to the U.S. illegally in 2012, got outed as such because he kept committing like small crimes. They'll be labeled traffic misdemeanors and things like that, but it's things like trespass, things like loitering outside a store, which usually they're there to rob the store. And they just get caught loitering in advance. And he just didn't show up at court hearings, and they finally caught up with him. He was ordered to be removed. And all of a sudden, this is what's happened on the left. And it really disappoints me as someone who's done a lot of representation in the asylum space over the years. The left decided to usurp asylum law and pretend everybody was an asylum person. And what it's done is people on the right now won't believe anybody has a legitimate asylum claim, which is too bad. But this guy is a classic example of asylum abuse. He realized he's going to get deported. And so all of a sudden he comes up, gets a new lawyer, goes before a new immigration official, and tells a whole new story. And the whole new story is, oh, my family is in this little business in El Salvador, and we got sideways with a gang, and they think I'm part of the other gang, and I'm not part of the other gang, but it doesn't matter. They're all going to kill me, and all these terrible things are going to happen, so you can't send me back there because I'll be tortured. And what happened was a bunch of immigration officials became pro-immigration, liberal Democrats that grabbed those immigration judge jobs. Because, and this is like what you're talking about, your friend on the island, St. Bart's, who's got a great assistant who would be great in the U.S., who can't get in. Why? Because those liberal Democratic immigration judges look at profiles like hers, and they're like, she's not a reliable political ally, out the door. So people with legitimate immigration claims were getting denied, and anybody that was seen as politically on the right side or politically a potential future voter, as Ghostbusters, Bill Murray said, think about all the wonderful voters' lives you're going to save. At one point, that's been the mindset of a lot of these folks. This guy gets a reprieve. His reprieve is solely that he's released on bail, that's why they call it catch and release, dating back to the Obama administration. They caught somebody illegally here, and they said, hey, please show up at your hearing in a couple of months. And of course, they released him. They never show up for the hearing. That's it. He's still ordered to be deported, just not deported to El Salvador, because this immigration judge buys this totally made up, to me, obviously made up claim, because it's, it comes 7 years late. There's no independent corroborating evidence, and so forth. And it doesn't meet the legal standard for asylum. Asylum is not, I live in a high crime jurisdiction. Otherwise, half the world could come to the United States. Then that's not a practicable option for the country to have.
Yeah. But so what I want to do, though, is I want to compartmentalize these. Let's focus on the Turkish gal, and then the 17 guys that got deported, not just deported, but sent straight to an El Salvadorian prison, where, as far as I can tell, they're there for life, or they're just there indefinitely. Like there's no, like, you got 5 years for doing this. There's none of that stuff. So, and why I want to separate those two is because the 17 gang members, most likely, allegedly, I think it's probably highly likely, they were here illegally, where the Turkish gal was not here illegally. Right. She was here legally. So let's go back to that point that you were making, that if we don't want you in our house, we can just tell you to go away. But as far as the Constitution goes, does that person is she protected by the First Amendment?
So everybody is protected by the Constitution if they're in U.S. jurisdiction.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
the question becomes, what amount of due process are they due, for example, and what amount of speech rights do they have? And so if you're illegally present in the country, you pretty much have no rights. The president can deport you at will, and there's really very few restraints because you're not legally present here to begin with. And the theory of the courts was, we're not going to reward you for illegally getting here. You have an access to a habeas petition. You can challenge it on due process, but you're only due the process the president affords you, and Congress gives you legislatively if you're present here illegally. So that's the group that has the least amount of due process. They're still constitutionally protected. They just don't have they're not treated as the same as, the way to think of it is, think of your property and liberty interest as a form of capital, if you will. And your degree of capital, your constitutional capital, it depends on your legal status. And that is, are you legally here? Now, let's go to category 2. Those people here on tourist visas, student visas,
right. So
limited
let's
visas.
Start there and then work backwards here.
Exactly. For that group, they have much more rights to due process of law and much more rights to free speech than do people that are not here legally to begin with. That group, but they don't have the same rights as a green card holder, and they don't have the same rights as a U.S. citizen.
But how does the Constitution differentiate? Because I read the Constitution and it just says persons. And if we're defining persons as anyone, and also would it be unalienable rights to free speech, how is the Constitution itself differentiating from someone that has a green card and someone that has a student visa?
It's because of how they interpret the due process clause and then how they interpret deportation. So the two different components of that is, on the due process clause, you're entitled constitutionally to all the process that is due, depending upon what your property or liberty interest is. And so the court, for example, has interpreted deportation of someone who is not a green card holder to not be punishment. Does that make sense? And so consequently,
absolutely.
And they think that if you're a student visa card holder, your property and liberty interest is at the lowest level of anybody that could have a immigration status. And so the process that's due, it's proportionate to the weight, to the amount of capital they give your property and liberty interest. And the reason why that changes based on legal status is because of how the Constitution gives Congress plenary authority over immigration. Now, there's a debate about that, but they interpret the naturalization clause to give Congress exclusive, because the other component of this is, first is what rights exist, but the other is who enforces those rights.
Yeah.
And in the immigration context, the courts have consistently, until recently, interpreted the Supreme Court this goes back to the Chinese Exclusion Act cases of the late 19th century, then the communist deportation cases of the 30s and 40s and 50s, famous Greek individual who was deported. Some of my liberal Democratic friends are forgetting Jimmy Carter did this in 1979. He actually mass deported every Iranian citizen student who was on a student visa here. Said, you're from Iran, you're out of here. And I mean, they did nothing other than be from Iran. So, I mean, and there's some case law. The law in this is very broad. And what it says is whatever Congress process they afford is all they're entitled to. And whatever the executive branch decides is unreviewable, because the courts don't, in most immigration cases, definitely in the Alien Enemies Act case, they said the courts can't review that. That's a presidential. The theory is, let's let the elected branches of government deal with any issue concerning immigration. And they interpret the Constitution's dedication of the naturalization clause to Congress and enforcement power to the president as keeping the judicial branch out of the immigration debate, unless you are a green card holder with the most rights. So student visa person, you're basically here on conditions, and those conditions are you don't participate and impact American politics in a way that the president interprets as a national security risk. And that basically that law is so broad, and in that capacity, your First Amendment rights are limited. In other words, that even if the reason why the president perceives you as being a national security threat is solely due to your speech, because you're here by permission on a student visa with the lowest level of recognized liberty or constitutionally cognizable property interest in the meaning of the Due Process Clause, we afford broad authority for him to do so. Now, the other way they've got around the First Amendment issue, now let's go to the green card holder. Green card holder has almost complete First Amendment protection. Famous communist here, Harry Bridges, who was a great labor activist in the he told the judge to go, and they tried to he had 3 cases reach the Supreme Court. That's how active Harry was. He was a little Aussie, came over here, little commie labor organizer back when I can respect the old school labor organizers, the Jimmy Hoffa's of the world. Those guys were you knew what their principles were, unlike government bureaucratic unions, which are a joke. But so Harry kept getting himself into some trouble, and they kept trying to deport poor Harry. And it was in Harry's case that the Supreme Court said, yes, there are First Amendment rights for resident aliens who have full green card holders, because the theory is that then it's like it's not like you've invited somebody over to your house. It's like you've invited somebody to be a co-tenant in your house, right? And then you want to you change the terms afterwards. Okay, can't do that. That's you have your property, your liberty interest goes up because your expectancy interest increases.
Yeah, you've legally invited someone into your house and signed a contract with them for 6 years or whatever it is, and now you want to boot them out after 3 months.
Exactly. That's why that person has the most protection.
Yeah.
And that's why, like the tough student, she can't be deported right away. They have to go through the whole legal proceedings. They have to go through an immigration official. She has the right to confront evidence. The government has to prove it by clear and convincing evidence that she actually violated a very specific provision. It's not clear they have that evidence. I mean, all that's been introduced so far. And then otherwise, if they're relying on the national security threat, then now that's supposed to be a non-reviewable decision, and I agree with that. I don't want the judicial branch running our immigration policy, right or wrong. I want the people to decide at elections within certain constitutional protections. She does have First Amendment protections under the Bridges case, so they're going to have to prove something beyond conduct. The way they got away with it in the communist cases is they said it was outside free speech because they were saying they wanted to overthrow the government by violent means. That was now later on, the Supreme Court would walk back that intense, sort of anti-commie position that defined everybody who ever had any affiliation at all with the Communist Party. Like some people are saying, well, these people are being mischaracterized or broadly brushed because of their affiliation with the Palestinian cause, that somehow they're pro-Hamas when they have not said anything pro-Hamas on the record. I encourage them from a legal perspective, their likely remedy is low because that happened to all the communists. There are a bunch of people who hadn't been communist members for 30 years, had never ascribed to the belief of overthrowing the government by violent means, who were kicked out of the country. Because the other component of this, and this is a good another way to quickly conceptualize it, what the Supreme Court said is if we can't draft you into the military to serve as war, then we can deport you whenever we want. That's in essence how the court, but if we can draft you, then we can't deport you whenever we want. With the restraint being that if it is First Amendment protected speech and you are a green card holder, that cannot be the sole and whole grounds to deport you. They're going to have to prove something beyond speech to deport the tough students or to deport the student that was part of the protest in New York. Now,
let me just summarize here just to make sure that we're all on the same page. And again, we're just focusing on the Turkish gal, the Turkish PhD student who wrote the op-ed at her university for her university paper. So what we have is we have the Constitution, and then it's very broad. And then what we have are Supreme Court cases that you're pulling from that interpret exactly, or that give their interpretation of exactly what the Constitution means, and therefore, in practice, that's law.
Exactly.
Do I have the flow right?
Yeah, and I would put it to me, the Constitution is what's law, but as a practicing lawyer, it's you're basically trying to guess what people with power are going to do.
Okay, so that's where we revert back to the Supreme Court decisions.
Exactly.
And that's where you're getting kind of this hierarchy of citizen, green card holder, and then let's just say student visa. So the student visa gal, she does have some rights based on Supreme Court rulings. So even if Trump doesn't like her, he can't just kick her out immediately. She has some kind of due process. And you're saying now in practice, it's going to be difficult for Trump to prove that she did anything that warrants a deportation if all she did was just write that op-ed. Now, she did other things, but that's going to be very, very difficult to prove. And so there's a high likelihood of her not being deported, even though this is kind of a hot topic. So so am I understanding it right, Robert?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the people that, like, some people were concerned. I saw some liberal friends of mine saying, don't come visit the United States on a tourist visa. You'll be arrested and deported to some random El Salvadoran prison. It's like that's not what's going on. But there are all kinds of protective protocols in place. The real judicial controversy has come about because judges are trying to prevent him from deporting people who are not lawfully present, who don't have any due process.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a second. So if you are someone that believes this Turkish gal should be immediately deported and should not have due process because she's not actually a citizen, then what you also have to be in favor of is when the next president gets into power, say that's Kamala Harris, let's just assume that it is, that you would also be in favor of her having the right to deport anyone that has a student visa for pretty much any reason she sees fit. So if you have a student, as an example, that's at the Mises Institute and writes an op-ed on how the government is bad, and therefore we need to make sure that we never lose the Second Amendment, well, then you would be in favor of Kamala Harris having the ability to immediately deport that person because they're in favor of the Second Amendment. Right.
Exactly. And that's where the utility there is the Bridges case. Now people get confused because, like I said, there are 3 Bridges Supreme Court cases. But I think it's the 1945 one, a great concurrence by an old school libertarian-oriented Supreme Court justice who's only on the bench 7 years, unfortunately, from Michigan. And he does a great history about why Harry Bridges is being targeted, back when Supreme Court judges actually cared about justice. We don't get that too often these days. But yes, you're absolutely right. So and people worried that people are going to be deported solely for their speech that are lawfully present don't need to be worried about that. There is complete constitutional protection for those individuals. They can go through the immigration process that is afforded them. They can likely go to a judicial process that is also afforded them under habeas corpus petition relief. And the Bridges case does protect them as long as what they were doing was just speech. And there's someone who was lawfully present here in the country. Yeah. Especially if they have a green card. Like, I believe, my understanding is the Tufts student effectively has a green card, permanent residency rights. I'm not certain of that, but that's my understanding. If she has just a student visa, then she has less free speech rights, but she still has some, and she can't be immediately deported. And you're right, from a policy perspective, the reason why I'm not in favor of, even if where the president may have the constitutional authority to do so, such as in national security cases, I've never been in favor of just the First Amendment activity ever being the basis of deportation, even though the courts don't consider deportation a punishment. So they don't see that as deprivation of property or liberty by itself. There has to be some additional act. To me, it's a bad policy because I want to maximize free speech in every context that we can.
Yeah, it just puts us on a very slippery slope, which is something that people have a difficult time with for some reason.
Well, and the best way is the way you put it. Never give yourself power you don't want your enemy to have. I always tell my conservative friends that. Just always remember that. It's tempting. Now, I get it. The reason why conservatives are so agitated is partly because of how immigration was abused. But I'll give an example how I did a deep dive. So I've represented people in the asylum context over a quarter century. I represented victims of domestic violence that had to escape into other countries and so forth, or escape here from other countries. But the other component was the Biden administration said even if you were a green card holder, you couldn't get access to the United States if you were outside the U.S. until you took the COVID vaccine. They used his immigration control to basically subject everybody to forced medical experimentation.
Right.
And I couldn't. Exactly. And I was complaining. I was like, some of my liberal friends that are complaining about Trump's actions. I was like, I could have used you guys' help back when Biden was systematically abusing this immigration power. And I tell it to my conservative friends now: don't jump on anything that allowed that to happen. That we should have. There's reasonable ways to have a balance. That you can have an effective immigration policy, effective border control policy. Not, I mean, I understand President Trump's viewpoint. He's like, these people are coming to my party and they're crapping on the food. Well, why do I have to have these people here? It's that pure businessman perspective that doesn't He's like, what the heck is this? This is nonsense. Oh, First Amendment, whatever. Get him out of here. So I understand his sentiment, his emotional response. That why is America giving free license to people to come to America, to take advantage of America, to then attack things that America.
What he really doesn't understand or just fails to recognize is the fact that one of the things that makes the United States so great and that makes the United States exceptional, or at least it did, is we were a country of law. We were not a country of men.
Right.
And Trump hates that. Well, like he might not be cognizant of that.
From a businessman perspective, it's red tape. It's I just want to get it done. Let's get it done. So I understand the mindset.
So do I.
It's where but I don't share it because it's like somebody were saying, how do you deal with these people? And I was like, what Thomas Jefferson said is still true. The best answer to bad speech is more speech, not less speech. Yeah. And so I still favor that position. And I get the frustration. You have a lot of these radical student groups. A lot of them are being funded directly or indirectly. Like somehow the student that was at NYU that's subject to this, he was on British payroll. And it's like, well, what was this guy doing on the British payrolls connected to the British? It's like, why is this person here? So I have bigger questions on some of those things. But in those areas, there really is enough protection that we shouldn't see any egregious abuse and mistakes that could occur in this context should be fixed and remedied through the legal process.
Okay. And my thing for people that are like, well, anyone who's not an American citizen should have no rights. They shouldn't have the freedom of speech. They shouldn't have these things. So if we deem that they are trespassing or we deem that they are an invader or something like that, then we can just get rid of them, regardless of whether they're here legally or illegally or whatever. And my point there is that's fine, but you've got to change the Constitution first. You can't just ignore the Constitution because it's not convenient or it doesn't have what you consider the right outcome for this case. You've got to change the Constitution. Then if you change the Constitution, then great. Then maybe we should change it to just only allow for the rights of the Constitution to be applied to people who are actual citizens. But that's a completely separate discussion, right? That's a separate discussion. And that's why we have checks and balances. It's not like we can't change the Constitution, but we can't, if we're going to maintain our rule of law, we can't just willy-nilly circumnavigate it.
Right. We can't amend the Constitution by judicial fiat.
Yeah.
And that's effectively what the left has been trying to do now.
Yeah.
And the right gets tempted to do because they see the left doing it and they're like, man, we could get this good policy outcome of dealing with the 20 million plus people here illegally if we didn't have to worry about all this bureaucratic nonsense. So I get the instinct, but what, as you point out, what makes America America is its ideas and ideals, is its constitutional framework, is the fact that you can be some foreigner, come here, spew whatever crap you want, you don't go to jail for it. Yeah. To me, that makes America great, not make America weak. And I think there's other ways to deal with the disturbances on campus and things like that. Like a lot of these groups are funded. A lot of what they were funded by ties back to government money or other money, and the disruptive activities are not protective speech activities, like when you're taking over a building or locking yourself in, some things like that. There's other ways to deal with that. As a whole, I thought there was an overreaction. It's not like those students made much of an impact at all in American politics. Other than reminding people in America that they don't really like these lefty protester tactics. It's not like France where, they got to do a protest every year. Everybody joins in as part of a national tradition to remember storming the Bastille. Here in the U.S., people line up in front of your car. Depends on what neighborhood, what city you're in. Chances are you might not survive that. So it's not the same mindset. But now when it gets to the people on the Alien Enemies Act, now, I will say I've never been a fan of the law because it easily tempts abuse of power.
Yeah.
To me, I wasn't a fan of I wasn't a fan of the Chinese Exclusion Act passed in the 1880s. I understand why. What happened is, railroads and others were There's a great show on Showtime people can see called Warrior. It's written by Bruce Lee. It's about late 19th century San Francisco. And you'll actually see the subtext in which the Chinese Exclusion Act originated from. And it was labor disputes. It was the same as partially what's happening now. You had Chinese labor willing to work cheaper than American labor would. And so you had American labor protesting that. That led to the exclusion of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the court repeatedly upheld its constitutionality, even for people that did nothing wrong. So that's what I find interesting now, the left pretending that somehow this is new presidential power Trump is asserting. And I'm like, we've been asserting this for over a century now. And in many instances, I disagreed with it on policy grounds. We were systematically excluding people just because they were Chinese. Then we were systematically excluding people based on the most attenuated ties to the Communist Party. If you were a labor activist in 1919, you could get deported. I didn't agree with what President Carter did, 1979. I mean, every single Iranian student has to be sent back. I mean, many of those were going to be anti the Ayatollah. I mean, they had come over to the United States when they had been part of the Shah's regime. Many of those Iranians would later become very positive contributors on the global stage. He was mass deporting all of them. But what is clear is no court until Trump has ever said a president can't do that in a case of national security exigency for someone who's not legally present in the country. That's who he's using. The Alien Enemies Act, they have decided, I think wisely on a policy basis, only to use that for people that were not legally here. They're not using it to remove people who are legally present. But that's the one where the judge was ordering them to return them.
So I was listening to a podcast today, and I want to give them credit here. I believe it was from the 10th Amendment Center. Does that sound right, Robert?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
yeah. And they were discussing the Alien Enemy Act, and they were breaking down some of the specifics. And it sounded like, in order to make this applicable, the United States government has to declare war against not just drugs or not just terrorism, but they have to actually declare war against a sovereign entity. So Russia, China, what have you. We have to be at war with another sovereign in order for this to apply. So was I understanding that correctly? If so, why? If not, why?
It goes to like our federal treason laws, for example. So there's a range of laws that are triggered by a declaration of war. And the Constitution gives Congress the exclusive authority to declare war. The unfortunate thing is that neither the Congress nor executive branch has followed that. I mean, it's like, how are we in all these foreign military conflicts without any declaration of war?
Yep.
So I think they're right conceptually. I think the way our system was designed was that before we get into using military means at any time, that Congress has a thorough, thoughtful debate and then issues a declaration of war, which also triggers a bunch of treaty clauses and provisions. It's why, for example, the reason why Putin has avoided using declaring war in the Ukraine, instead calls it, special military operation, because it would trigger a whole bunch of legal consequences in Russia for treaties and other things if they called it a declared war. So because, it's ironic, because especially after all the treaties we signed after World War II, like that's when we had this explosion of global treaties, UN Convention Against Torture, all those things. The downside has been it disincentivized nations to declare war because it then triggers a bunch of those treaty provisions. They don't want to trigger those treaty protective provisions about how you treat people and so forth. And I think that's caused more headache than help in the end. But yeah, I think they are correct about how that law was originally intended to be interpreted and applied.
That in order, just to be clear, in order to trigger the Alien Enemy Act, Congress would need to declare war, not just on drugs or something abstract, terrorists, not even against Mexican gangs. They would have to declare war on Mexico. They would have to declare war on Venezuela, another sovereign nation.
Correct. And there's a different constitutional clause that says you can declare an invasion and then take certain steps separately, but that's separate from the Alien Enemies Act clause, which is statute enforcing certain constitutional provisions. But there's no question, in my view, that they anticipated that would happen. It hasn't happened, and then the second component is who enforces it. It's really a self-enforcing provision. In other words, the courts have no, at least until Trump, the courts all acknowledge that the Constitution didn't give a role for the judicial branch as to whether war has been declared or not. That is solely, and whether that triggers other laws and treaty requirements. They say that is a non-reviewable decision by the political branches, the elected branches of government. Now, partially they do that to avoid political controversy that they're not avoiding at the moment. But another reason is the Constitution did intend that decisions of that consequence be left in the hands of the political branches, and their decision is non-reviewable. So they might be wrong, but there's no mechanism or method in place to challenge their actions in court, or at least there weren't until now.
Okay, so the Alien Enemies Act is not really a good argument for the legal authority to go ahead and just do these mass deportations. So what would be a good legal argument to justify that?
Well, I think the Alien Enemies Act doesn't really provide that authority in the way that was originally intended to be. I don't think the invasion clause really was intended to reach this. So now here's where Trump's argument, from a policy perspective, makes sense. Okay. He's like in the birthright citizenship debate context. He's like, what we're facing now was never anticipated when these clauses were written, and I get that. You got to change the Constitution. You can't just ignore it. That goes back to our original point. Exactly, and that's where I agree on that side. So what they have the advantage of is they've had prior precedent, if you will, of multiple presidents who've used the Alien Enemies Act without it being challenged, questioned, or contested, even without declaration of war. Okay. And so that's what they're relying on. I mean, like the most glaring example, especially I give this to my liberal and libertarian friends out there that oppose what Trump is doing. It's like you got to go back to Jimmy Carter. It's like almost nobody questioned his legal authority to do what he did. And again, it was every Iranian citizen solely because of their national origin who were here legally, who were all mass deported overnight. Just because he was unhappy with the Iranian government without any declaration of war against the Iranian government, despite the hostage situation. We haven't declared war since World War II. Okay, so but what would be the correct legal argument for deporting, let's just assume for a moment the illegals. We're not talking about deporting, people that are legally here and whatnot. Sure. For the illegals, my view is the president's got carte blanche to do that anyway. He's given full executive authority. If you're not legally present here, he's under no illegal obligation to afford you any process whatsoever, and he can legally deport you at any time. And he has that authority through the Constitution to execute the laws. Okay, so and to be clear, the Alien Enemy Act is unnecessary for that purpose. Okay, but that is only applicable to people that are here legally? No, he's only applying it to people here illegally. He's just wanting to expedite the process. He's not wanting to go through the administrative deportation process. Yeah. Now, in my view, he doesn't have to. I mean, all of when people say immigration judge, what they don't know is that's just a bureaucratic official that works for the president. It's not an independent part of the federal judicial branch. And so the president can override their decision anytime he wants. So that's where the president, in my view, has always had carte blanche for someone that's illegally present, that cannot show they had a legal right to ever be here. Those people, the president's always had the authority under existing laws and the Constitution to just mass deport them. And he doesn't need to. He's using the Alien Enemies Act because it's a specific provision that prior presidents have used legally, and then to short circuit, expedite the process. But again, I don't think he constitutionally has to, but that's why he's doing it. And the second reason is because, frankly, it sounds good politically, right? Oh, he's getting alien enemies out, right? It's like Trump, right? It's the way Trump's the language. He loves the language of that law when they're like, "Oh, that's a great law. I love it." By the way, it was started because of Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold kept showing up in different ways, and he tried to come back in and help the Brits against the U.S. A second time. By sneaking people in, and that was partially where the Alien Enemies Act law was passed, was to deal with the Benedict Arnolds of the world. So that's the approach. But yeah, president has really broad constitutional authority And that's why I encourage friends of mine that are on the pro-immigration side, go back and read some of that you're arguing for a change of the Supreme Court precedent, whether they want to acknowledge that or not. Because the language is stuff like, if the president doesn't like what race they are, he can exclude them. That's the Supreme Court of the United States has that language explicit, right? So it's broad. And, maybe it's good policy, maybe it's bad policy, but it's the Constitution basically gave the president carte blanche to control the border, and Congress carte blanche to determine what rules would allow you to be here legally. And so if you're someone that's here legally, then you're subject to Congress's rules and the president enforces them. And there's sometimes a judicial role if you're a green card holder whose First Amendment rights are being violated. But for everybody else, he's got carte blanche to do whatever he wants to do. Now, the problem is liberal Democratic judges are trying to overturn everything. They even directed him to tell him where he's got to spend money, which personnel he has to have, what programs have to be in place, what people have to be in the military, who has to run the CIA. I mean, they're just going berserk. There have been more injunctions issued against President Trump in 100 days than all other presidents combined over our whole history.
Yeah, but I want to focus just on the law, and then we'll get into how it's being applied, I guess. But just to be clear, the Alien Enemy Act is applicable to people that are here legally.
Yes.
Or is it applicable to people that are here illegally?
It was used, for example, during World War I and World War II on like Germans and then later the Japanese.
Okay.
People who are here legally, but they sent them out anyway.
Okay, understood. Now let's move on to discussing these gang members specifically, and let's first of all, how do we know someone is here illegally? Like if they. Where do we start the due process here? Like, can the government just claim that you are here illegally and then just kick you out, even though you are a citizen? I mean, shouldn't you have due process? And you say, well, George, yes, because Robert's a citizen. Well, how do we know that to begin with if there's no due process?
Yeah,
so where does it start?
Ones that are using it against currently are mostly people that have already been ordered removed. So there's a bunch of people, this will probably surprise a lot of people. There's a bunch of people over the last 10 years that immigration officials have ordered removed from the country that are still in the country.
Okay.
So they decided to focus on them out of the gate. But then the second question is, effectively the government comes and accuses you're not here legally. You can then challenge that by producing evidence that in fact you are here legally. And that in fact you have a right to judicial access if you have a legal right to be here and the government's ignoring it. So that's what gives you access to the judicial branch, is if they say you're not legally here and in fact you have proof you are legally here. Now it depends on what the legal basis that you're here for as to who adjudicates that. So if it's a student visa, certain kinds of green card holders, that just goes through the immigration administrative legal process before it ever reaches judicial process, with a right of circuit courts to review the Board of Immigration Appeals. So you have an immigration, now all those are DOJ officials, immigration official, the immigration board, but then you have a right of judicial review at the federal appellate level, which reviews what the Bureau of Immigration did, and like asylum claims or anything else. So if you claim you're legally entitled to be here, you have a right to not only administrative legal review and to stay in the country while that's occurring, but a right of judicial review. So Congress gave you those rights under the naturalization laws. Okay. And that's what gives your rights under due process.
Okay, so we can assume these 17 or 15 or whatever it was, these alleged gang guys, they went through that process. They already had due process based, or at least the way you just described it, to determine definitively in a court of law or however it was done that they are here illegally. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic.
Now, if you're here illegally and you don't have any proof that you're here legally, then you don't have a right to that administrative or judicial review process. So in other words, you've got to have some proof that you're here legally in order to trigger that process. Simply claiming you're here legally without any evidence or proof wouldn't provide that. So
but where do you provide the proof? Like okay, just let's say I'm accused.
If they won't give it to you administratively, that's where you have a right of habeas corpus. So most immigration disputes like this are decided. So somebody which just means my body is being illegally detained, And the key is you got to get to the court before you actually get deported. If somehow you get deported and you're now in somebody else's custody, there's nothing the U.S. courts can do, nothing the U.S. government can really do. Like, so that one gentleman that got deported back to El Salvador, his only relief or remedy is with the El Salvadoran courts. He could appeal to international bodies that the El Salvadoran court, the El Salvadoran government is part of at some level. But basically,
accuse me of not being in the United States legally. Before we get to that due process step, I have the ability to show them my birth certificate. Who do I show? Do I just show
it would be first? It'd be whoever the immigration official is. You say, you are illegally detaining me. I'm a U.S. citizen, and I approve of it. And that's how that process goes through. And I think there'll be there's a lot of controversy right now attended to these, which I think is what Trump wants. Trump wants maximum attention to this because I think Trump's main goal is to just cut off the spigot, to discourage people from continuing to come. Say, look, what kind of nightmare. You could be on your little college campus and suddenly guys with masks grab you off the street, old school drug cartel kidnapping style. And Trump doesn't mind those headlines because he wants to scare the rest of the world to quit coming. Because he knows, practically speaking, it'll be very hard to deport most of the people that are illegally present here. That's just a monstrous undertaking. But what he can do is shut off the spigot so that they quit coming. So at least you don't have the bleeding doesn't keep going. I think realistically, he'll probably deport 4 to 5 million people over 4 years. That means 15 to 20 million that are here illegally stay. That's just that's what the Biden administration knew, and it's why conservatives are so sort of up in the arms, and they're like, I don't care how you do it, get them out kind of mindset.
Yeah.
And in the process, forgetting the importance of constitutional protection that ultimately will protect them down the road from rogue liberal judges and rogue liberal presidents. It is because they knew this reality, that it's practically so hard because we afford so many legal protections. America still affords more legal protection for immigrants than any country in the world. Many other countries don't have any due process. I represented people. In fact, they called it for one of my clients, the habeas grabus. They even sent that to the head of the Department of Justice. The habeas grabus is on. They snagged him in Panama, threw him on a plane, kidnapped his rear end back to the U.S. Because they couldn't legally extradite him. That happens around the world, unfortunately. But the U.S. still has very robust protections. People are going to see a lot of scary headlines. And understand Trump wants those scary headlines, but not because those scary headlines are true. It's because he wants people to stop coming here so that he can at least stop the bleeding.
Okay, got it. So now let's move on to the gang members not just being deported, but sent directly to an El Salvadorian prison. So the way I see this is, and for some reason, I don't know how this happens, but everyone or a lot of people on Twitter and social media kind of conflate the two as though deportation and sending someone to prison indefinitely are the exact same thing. And in my book, they're not. And I just see this as, okay, we're sending people to prison. Yeah, they may look scary. Sure, they might have some tattoos. Sure, they might have brown skin. Sure, the government might say they're bad guys. But the same FBI and CIA said Trump was a Russian asset, right? So I don't know why all of a sudden we're believing them. So my concern there is that we're sending people to prison for indefinitely without going through a due process. So walk me through the law there. Is it that we just have the right to do that, and that anyone that's in the country illegally just is in jeopardy of getting in the crosshairs of the government and being sent to prison for life? How does that work?
I'm almost certain that they're not under our legal control. And I'll explain why. The U.S. cannot imprison someone on that basis. So to give you an example, people who illegally entered the country, this was back during the Chinese Exclusion Act cases.
Okay.
And the Congress passed some laws basically saying you could be put to hard labor for 60 days if you came in illegally. But they were going to just let an immigration judge, a bureaucratic official, decide that. Supreme Court said, no, if you're going to punish them, which again, they said deportation was not punishment, but they said imprisonment absolutely is. They said then you have to afford them all the same rights as a U.S. citizen.
Yeah.
Right to venue, right to counsel, right to present a defense, right against self-incrimination, right to a federal, a Senate-appointed judge, a Senate-appointed appeals court.
Even if they're here illegally, just to be very, very
Right.
clear, even if they're here illegally.
Yep, the right to trial by jury. You can't criminally prosecute without going through our criminal process, which requires all those robust constitutional rights.
Okay.
So my guess is now legally when you deport, technically you just drop the person off at the border. Like this actually come up a lot in the context of Latin America. So like the one of the first cases dealing with when does a court have jurisdiction if someone's been kidnapped. So the Pinkertons went down to South America and kidnapped a guy, brought him back. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, that's okay. The court didn't get jurisdiction by kidnapping him. He just happened to show up there, right? So this is the myth of you just drop him off the border. What happens after that? So apparently that's what we're doing with El Salvador. So all of these people are really subject to whatever. What I'm curious about is what El Salvador is imprisoning them based on. Now, part of it is El Salvador under this president decided they'd had enough with the gang violence that ripped that country apart for 70 years. Now, of course, that gang violence came because we overthrew the government. Arbeñez, he was a lefty, part commie, but we shouldn't have overthrown the government, and it led to, civil war that led to gang violence being encoded into their culture for the next half century. So some of that's on the U.S., frankly. But this guy, the president of El Salvador, big pro Bitcoin guy, he started from the left, and he just got in and was like, this isn't working. And he sort of moved to the sort of populist right, if you will. Okay. Because he was like, we just got to lock everybody up for a while. He goes, everybody's a gang member, you're getting locked up. And I get that maybe it's unfair and all the rest. He said, but it's better than having a crime-torn country. We can't do anything. We can't function as a government. So maybe it's under those continued laws that he's received people from the United States that the United States has told him are gang members. And he's like, well, based on our domestic law, we can imprison them for some time period. But because of that U.S. law, and what U.S. officials have now said in court, they don't have a deal with El Salvador to imprison these people. They're just dropping them off at the El Salvadoran airport. And the El Salvadoran officials are taking them to El Salvadoran prison.
I thought these gang members were Venezuelan.
Yeah, they are. But they're Venezuelan gang members being imprisoned in El Salvador by the El Salvadoran president under their domestic authority, because we don't have the ability to imprison them under our legal.
Why aren't we dropping them? If we're just oblivious here and we're the guys, we're the good guys. Obviously, we're not putting them in prison. We're just sending them to El Salvador. Okay, yeah. Well, damn well what's going to happen to them when they get to El Salvador.
This has been one of the.
I was born at night, but it wasn't that last night. Exactly. So then why are we sending them to Venezuela?
It's one of the oldest scams in the immigration book, and it's like how my client got deported back to the United. What happened is the Panama officials just dropped him off at the Panama airport, and they unlocked his handcuffs, and all of a sudden the U.S. Marshal put handcuffs on him. Now, in fact, that U.S. Marshal didn't have legal authority to do so. He could have been charged with kidnapping in Panama. He could have been charged with kidnapping in the U.S. He could have been, but everybody knows what's really happening. So it's the whole drop them off the border, and golly gee, look what happened. They ended up in jail. Yeah. But this is a scam they've been running in the immigration context. They do it to get around extradition laws. They get it to all kinds of people get accidentally deported to the country they're seeking their extradition when that country couldn't extradite them legally. They're like, no, we're not extraditing you. We're just dropping you off in the airport of the country that wants to put you in prison.
Okay, so what you're saying is the reason what your opinion is, the reason we didn't send these gang members to Venezuela and we sent them to El Salvador is we knew that if we did send them to El Salvador, they would get locked up.
Yeah, because he said so publicly on Twitter. He said, send him here. I'm happy to lock him up. That's what we do. We lock up gang members. And so we knew that was going to happen, but there really can't be any legal agreement in place, because if there was, that would make them subject to U.S. law, which means they would be subject to being returned. They would be subject to U.S. jurisdiction and courts. They have a right to a jury trial, all of those things. So what we did now, the other component of this is Venezuela keeps going back and forth on whether they're going to take people. 1 minute they're saying yes, then they say no, then they say yes, then they say no. And so this was partially Trump punishing Venezuela. The other thing that I think will start to come out, he may even have a legal basis to invoke the invasion provision as it applies to TDA members, is there probably is evidence the Venezuelan government deliberately sent TDA members into the United States, that they actually facilitated their means to do so, and so forth. And I think it probably was payback. I mean, the Venezuelan gangs put MS-13 to shame. I mean, these guys are a whole new level of violent and crime and all the rest.
Yeah, but my concern there, Robert, is number one, how do you determine that? How has it been legally proven that they're part of the gang? I mean, I don't know how you would determine that. And then number two, how do we determine that they've actually committed a crime? Because I don't know. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but just because you're part of this gang doesn't necessarily mean that you've actually committed a crime in the United States other than being here illegally.
Correct. And that's where I'm assuming that it's subject to El Salvador's domestic laws. That basically what El Salvador said is if you send us somebody that you tell us is a gang member, under our domestic law, we can lock them up in ways that you can't.
And you're squeaky clean because you technically didn't lock them up without due process.
Correct. Now, I'm not a big fan of this protocol, and I'll explain to people why. There is a context for this. We've been doing this in the last couple of decades, and I'm not a fan of this. It's called rendition. That this is how our rendition worked. You took them to a black site that was in a country where it was legal to do what they were doing. That effectively legal. You knew the authorities weren't going to do anything about it, put it that way. But often it was legal or not frowned upon in certain places. And that's why the black sites were located where they were. In a great movie by great book by Jean Le Carré that became a movie with Philip Seymour Hoffman on this. And it portrays what happens if, to your precise question, what happens if you rendition someone who's innocent? Not some dangerous, scary terrorist you need to get intel from on the eve of an attack, but some guy wrongfully blamed by a jealous ex, by a local business competitor. Like this happened in Afghanistan all the time. You didn't like, the so-and-so looked at your girlfriend the wrong way. Just call up the U.S. and say, hey, guess who's an Al-Qaeda terrorist? Yeah, exactly. This guy right down the street.
Exactly. Or you got some guy in your neighborhood you don't like that's Mexican, has dark skin and a couple tattoos. And you're like, oh, I've got some intel, gang member. And then the next thing you know, he's in an El Salvadorian prison for the rest of his life.
And that's why, to the Trump administration credit, they haven't taken the bait of, they focused on people that have gone through a process where there has been evidence, where there has been adjudication. Right. And I'm glad they have. Yeah. And again, very sympathetic with conservative frustration at what's occurred. But we've got to stick with the constitutional process. As I always say, there's very few problems of governance that the Constitution doesn't provide you an answer for. And if your answer is the Constitution needs to be improved, the Constitution provides that. That's Article 5. Here's how you amend. And so that's we shouldn't abandon that process, even if the judges on the left are abandoning that process, even if the Biden administration abandoned that process. We should still believe in it and fight for it because I think the Constitution is worth fighting for.
Yeah, two wrongs don't make a right. And just to be very clear for the audience, my position is not that we shouldn't be deporting these people. If someone is here illegally, okay, great, and you outline the legality behind this extremely well, then let's deport them. But sending them to a prison when they haven't gone through due process, or sending them to the border of El Salvador with a wink, wink, nod, nod, that is, at least looking at the spirit of the law, is completely unconstitutional, even for someone that is in the United States illegally. And that's not something that I think we should disregard just because we approve of gang members being locked up, and let's be clear, alleged gang members being locked up. And fortunately, in this case, it seems like they have gone through that process in the United States to determine they, in fact, are gang members, as opposed to, just someone that Trump doesn't like.
Right. Oh, exactly. So far they have been following the internal processes, and these numbers are pretty small. Like we're about 17. I mean, I think there's thousands of TDA gang members here. We know because they announced themselves and they decided to take over towns. Took over like part of Aurora, Colorado. Hey, this is our town now. Welcome. Yeah. Muchas gracias. But yes, I think it's important we follow the constitutional process at each stage. That I get why Trump is doing it. It's smart on Trump's part. Basically, he's got 17 people that have actually been adjudicated, but he knew the media would go nuts no matter what. And he doesn't mind the crazy stories. He doesn't mind people thinking he's randomly picking up random people being randomly pointed because he wants people terrified of illegally coming to the U.S. That's his goal, is to use this as a global PR campaign to discourage terrorism, in illegal immigration.
Yeah,
but
get it.
underneath the hood, they actually are complying with the process.
It's just the Machiavellian, the means justify, or the end justifies the means. I'm not. That's not me.
I understand that entirely.
I don't like that.
Yeah, what is this to explain to people? They're going to see scary headlines. Know the scary headlines are probably not true, but the reason why they're there is not just because the left hates Trump, but also because Trump wants those scary headlines. So people are confused, like, okay, why would Trump want a scary headline that's not true? Because he wants the scary headline to deter illegal immigration. But in fact, internally, they're following all the proper protocols and procedures for how they go about this.
They are, but they're not following the spirit of the law. I guess we're splitting hairs there. But I would be much more comfortable with this if they dropped them off at the Venezuelan border.
Oh yeah, agree. Well, early on they did. Apparently, Venezuela has said no for a while. So they said no, then they said yes, then they went back to saying no.
Yeah, I don't buy that argument, Robert, because look, they're.
You could always.
Trump, when the president here in Colombia said that he wouldn't take that plane full of Colombians, within 30 seconds, Trump got on the phone.
He forgot to look at his balance sheet. How many exports to the U.S. versus how many imports from the U.S.
Right.
And didn't realize that's only going one direction there.
Yeah, and then conveniently, when Venezuela apparently says we're not going to take these gang members, then Trump's completely silent on that one. And just,
right.
Okay, fine. Then I guess we'll just send him to El Salvador. And
because I think he loves the PR of it. He loves the PR image of it. These are people that he could have locked up here in the U.S. So that's what's so internally. But the reason, like, people are wondering, well, why isn't that fact being broadcast? Why is Trump allowing the media to represent this as people just randomly picked up off the street? It's because he wants to scare people around the world. So it's explaining to people why there's a discrepancy between the headlines and what's actually happening. What's happening is he's taking hardcore people he could lock up here, sending them to El Salvador where they can lock them up with minimal risk. There's one or two people that might have not been the established record not have been crystal clear on. That's the Maryland father of three guy. But you dig into his record, and I think most of his story is fake, to be honest with you.
Right. But if you lock him up here, I'm totally okay with that. I'm totally okay with bad guys who commit crimes going to prison, whether they're citizens or not citizens. It's just the due process part. If Trump were to have locked them up in the United States, they would have gone, they would have had as fair of a trial as they could have, and they would have had an opportunity to prove that they're actually innocent before going to prison, and it wouldn't have been just on a whim of the federal government. And that's really my point here.
Oh yeah, and I understand that. And basically, he doesn't mind people thinking he's willing to violate due process to scare them from coming into the country. The upside is he hasn't actually violated due process if you look under the hood, but he's not going to broadcast that fact because he wants them terrified of coming to the country.
Understood. Okay, Robert, how can people find out more about what you do?
Oh, sure. So if you want to follow the law and politics, we have that at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. We got to keep Viva in America. That's another reason to make sure these rules are strictly applied. Otherwise, they'll be sending them back to Canada, and Canada will be sticking them in a detention center someplace for rogue political behavior, as they're trying to do to the presidents of people wanting to be president of France or Romania or Ireland even. And then otherwise, for all the political betting markets and sports markets, even, we trade on whether the Fed is going to raise or cut rates even, made profits on that. That's at sportspicks.locals.com.
Awesome. Robert, thanks again for coming on such short notice. And it's always awesome to talk. And you always, whether I agree with you or not, you always get me thinking. But I think on this topic, I think that we agree on about 99% of it.
Yeah, exactly. There's the headlines. There's what's really happening. There's what to be worried about, what to be careful about. And the important message, I think, to conservatives and libertarians is the Constitution is always worth fighting for, even if the people you have to fight on behalf of are not always the most desirable.
Yeah. And it's just like free speech. The definition of free speech is not the ability to say whatever you want as long as I like it. Right. Or as long as it fits my narrative, or as long as it doesn't hurt my feelings. The definition of free speech is that you're able to say things that are offensive. And it's the same thing with the Constitution. We have to recognize that it is the law, and we can't just apply it when it's convenient or when it fits the narrative of Team Red or Team Blue. That's what makes us exceptional as a country.
Correct. And I'm glad people are getting a crash course on how immigration really works. Because a lot of people thought one thing, but it's wild how different it really is under the hood.
Yeah. All right, buddy. Have a good one.
Thanks, man.
Hey, guys, I'd like to personally invite each and every one of you to attend this year's Rebel Capitalist Live. This is the incredible conference I put on annually that helps you build a bulletproof portfolio. It helps you increase your personal freedom and liberty, and also it helps you increase the size of your network. In other words, you get to meet a lot of like-minded individuals, fellow Rebel Capitalists. It's in Orlando, May 23rd through the 25th. Past speakers have included people like Robert Kiyosaki, Ron Paul, Peter Schiff, Mike Maloney, Lynn Alden, just to name a few. So to get your tickets ASAP and to find out who is speaking at this year's Rebel Capitalist Live, you can check it out at rebelcapitalistlive.com. And just a little quick insider information, if you get your tickets sooner than later, you can get a discount, because as we get closer and closer to the event, the tickets go up in price. So don't wait. Go to rebelcapitalistlive.com right now and get your tickets, and I will see you in Orlando, May 23rd through the 25th.